next sitting day, and we call now on Government Order of the Day number 3.
New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Amendment Bill, first reading.
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I move that the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Finance and Expenditure Committee to consider the bill. And Mr Speaker, I want to start by acknowledging the encouragement and support of the Attorney-General, who's clearly keen to see this bill pass through the House. Mr Speaker, this bill implements some changes to Part 2 of the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Act, and these are changes related to the activities of the Guardians of New Zealand Superannuation. And they are the manager and administrator of the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. So, Mr Speaker, I just want to remind the House about why the activities of the fund might matter. It was set up under the previous government by Dr Michael Cullen with an elegant legislative scheme and funding formula designed to allow New Zealand to pre-fund some of the costs of national super. In fact, pre-fund it to the extent that tax rates would hold steady while the population aged. And in that sense, it's taxpayers, a form of saving for today's taxpayers where they will avoid tax increases in the future. And Mr Speaker, the New Zealand Super Fund is getting rather large, even though the government has not made contributions over the last, since we've been in government, over the last 5 years, because we weren't willing to borrow to make contributions to the fund. It has made fairly significant returns. Well, you can always see, even in retrospect, actually, I wouldn't have changed. The government would not have changed its view about that issue. Because of the returns, it's now built up to a $25 billion fund. And it's part of an ongoing process of change in the taxpayer's balance sheet. In fact, if you add up all the managed funds on the taxpayer's balance sheet, the New Zealand government balance sheet, it's well north of 50 billion, and before too long will reach 60 billion. The popular perception, I have to say, cultivated by the opposition, is that taxpayers own lots of businesses that generate lots of profits. That might have been the case in the past, but just to give a sense of the size, the relative size of these things, the electricity generators all rolled up together may be worth, say, 10 billion. The New Zealand Super Fund is 2.5 times the value of all the electricity generators put together, and in fact is a pretty similar size to ACC. So over time, the Super Fund and ACC will continue to grow, and our balance sheet is becoming increasingly dominated by shares and bonds owned by the Crown. So it's becoming much more of a fund manager's balance sheet and much less of a business owner's balance sheet. In fact, the proportion of it that's devoted to businesses is probably down to somewhere around 4 or 5% now. The proportion of it that is managed funds is growing pretty rapidly, and that which is property holdings, roads, hospitals, schools, is pretty steady. So over time, the efficiency, the governance of these government-controlled fund managers is going to become more and more significant to the economy and certainly to the taxpayer's balance sheet. And that is why there's an ongoing program of work looking at the efficiency and effectiveness of the management of the New Zealand Super Fund, but also the other large funds, ACC, GSF, National Provident Fund, and the small one in the litter, the Public Trustee. So there's a focus on whether we're getting whether we've got the structures right there. Because, for instance, lower costs over 20 or 30 years can make a big difference to the return. The way these funds are organised to manage the much more significant risks they're taking is pretty critical to taxpayers. The flip side of these high returns of recent years in the super fund is high risk. The reason they make big returns at the moment is because they're making fairly risky investments. There will be years where they make zero or negative returns. That is almost certain in a long-term fund. I'd have to say, though, in this case, that the previous government set up this fund in about as sensible a way as you could for a government-owned entity. And that is, it's got an independence that we respect, that I think the whole Parliament respects, and that is particularly important around its investment policies. The biggest risk to the taxpayer around this fund is that one day politicians decide to override the legislation in order to instruct the fund how to invest. It follows theories of diversification. A substantial part of its investment is outside of New Zealand. In fact, the majority of its investment is outside of New Zealand. So essentially it takes cash generated by New Zealand households and businesses and it invests that in offshore equity and debt markets. It's one of the reasons I don't get too worried about the fact that New Zealand borrows money overseas, because that's not that difficult, particularly if it's matched by investment overseas. It also gives another aspect to the discussions about foreign investment in New Zealand. The New Zealand government is a fast-growing foreign investor in other countries, and I'd expect that that investment is respected by the sovereign governments who run those countries, that we don't find ourselves as investors in Australia, the US, the UK, the victims of arbitrary and populist policies about being a foreign investor. So, Mr. Speaker, the efficiency with which the New Zealand Super Fund operates is going to matter and become increasingly significant. The bill here focuses on one reasonably significant issue and then a number of other minor changes, but they've all been sought by the Guardians. The current legislation prevents the Guardians from having control of an entity. That was a soundly conceived protective measure. A fund of this size could easily control a significant part of the New Zealand Stock Exchange. Even now, it probably owns a significant proportion of it. So this bill allows the super fund to pursue the global best practice where it can control entities which are formed for the purpose of holding, facilitating or managing investments of the fund. It doesn't extend to control doesn't relax the prohibition on control of New Zealand entities, but it does allow it to run the kind of investment entities that are quite common for large fund managers. They'll get added flexibility, and we would hope, in fact the reason we're making the change is because they believe, and we've take their advice, that it will allow them to structure and access investments more efficiently, and that will lead to greater returns for given quantities of risk that the Guardians take with their investment. Mr. Speaker, there's a number of other smaller changes, for instance, enabling the Guardians to delegate the power to appoint custodians and investment managers to those who manage funds on behalf of the Guardians, so they don't have to do it all themselves, to grant powers of attorney in respect of the management of the fund. These things have been looked at in some real detail, and it's considered that it will help the fund to act more efficiently. There's also some references here to the nature of the fund to clarify them in order to remove ambiguity about the nature of the fund, and that is the legislation explicitly states that the fund is not a separate entity of the Crown. Mr. Speaker, there is potential for material gains from this, and I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable David Parker.